Hi, this is Akshara from GoAskNow. Let's get into the chapter 8, Heredity. In the last chapter, we have seen that reproductive process give rise to new individuals that are similar but subtly different. Also, how amount of variation is produced even during asexual reproduction. And the number of successful variation are maximized by the process of sexual reproduction. Now let's take up sugarcane plants in the field. We see that the variation among the individual plants are very little. But in a number of animals, particularly human beings which reproduce sexually, the variation are quite distinct and are visible among different individuals. In this chapter, we shall be studying the mechanism by which variation are created and inherited. Let's get deeper into it. Accumulation of variation during reproduction. Inheritance from previous generation provides both a common basic body design and subtle change in it for next generation. So now let's think about what would happen when this new generation in its turn reproduce. So the following generation will have differences that have inherited from the first generation as well as newly created differences. So let's see an illustration in the figure 8.1. This is a asexual reproduction. Consider a single individual reproduces and creates two bacteria, and we could see that one has a red spot and another with a green. And these two individuals on further reproduction create two for each. And we see that the variations of the four newborn bacteria are different from the new generation and also to the first generation. This is the case of asexual reproduction with small inaccuracies in DNA copying. However, if sexual reproduction is involved, even greater diversity will be generated, as we will see when we discuss the rules of inheritance. So, do all these variation in the species have equal chances of surviving in the environment in which they find themselves? Obviously not. So, depending on the nature of variations, different individuals would have different kind of advantage. Let's take bacteria that can withstand heat will survive better in a heat wave. As we have discussed earlier, section of variant by environmental factors form the basis for evolutionary process, as we will discuss in later sections. So this give rise to two questions. If a trait A exists in 10% of a population, consider asexual reproducing species, and trait B exists in 60% of the same population. So, what do you think? Which trait is likely to have arisen earlier? Obviously, trait B, right? Then, how the creation of variation in a species promotes survival? This is a deeper question. So let's get to know what is heredity. The most obvious outcome of the reproductive process still remains the generation of individuals of similar design. The rules of heredity determine the process by which traits and characters are reliably inherited. Let us take a closer look at these rules. Inherited traits. So, what exactly do we mean by similarities and differences? So, we know that child bears all the basic features of human being. However, it does not look exactly like the parents, and the human population show a deal of variation. So, we know that each individual has different features and body structures. So, let's get into a quick activity. So, you can observe students in your neighborhood and check for their earlobes, having free or attached earlobes, and calculate the percentage and note it down. Also, the earlobe of their parents for each child, and you can correlate the earlobe type of each individual with their parents. Based on these evidence, suggest a positive rule for the inheritance of earlobe types. You can check the earlobe types in figure 8.2. A is free and B is attached. So, what are the rules for the inheritance of traits Mendel contributed? So, when we talk about inheritance traits, Mendel plays a vital role. The rule of inheritance of such traits in human beings are related to the fact that both the father and the mother contribute, particularly equal amount of genetic material to the child. This means that each trait can be influenced by both paternal and maternal DNA. Thus, for each trait, there will be two variations in each child. What will then the trait seen in the child be? Mendel, the father of genetics, worked out the main rules of such inheritance, and it is interesting to look at some of his experiments from more than a century ago. Now let's learn about Gregory Johann Mendel, 1822 to 1884. He was educated in a monastery and went on to study science and mathematics at University of Vienna. He is a failure in teaching certificate, but that does not stop his scientific quest. He went on back to his monastery and started growing peas. Many others have also studied the inheritance of traits in peas and other organisms earlier. But Mendel blended his knowledge of science and mathematics and was first one to keep count of individual existing a particular trait in each generation. This helped him to arrive at the laws of inheritance. So how does he do it? He used number of contrasting visible characters of garden peas, round and wrinkled, seed structure, or tall or short plants, or white or violet flowers, and so on. He took a pea plant with different characteristics, for example, a tall plant and a short plant, produced progeny by crossing them, and calculated the percentage of tall or short progeny. So, in the first place, there were no halfway characters in this first generation. So, we can take this figure 8.3 and check it out. So, the first, he took the parent tall one and the short one and crossed them to produce 4 tall F1 generation. All of them were tall. And then he took 2 of them from F1 generation and crossed them. And here we could see that there are 4 new plants with 3 of tall and 1 with a short trait. So in the first generation, the short trait has been hidden, and that hidden trait is transformed to F2 generation. So the copies of F2 generation have 3 tall plants and 1 short plant which is inherited from the F1 generation. So what we could conclude, this led Mendel to propose that 2 copies of factor, calling it as genes, controlling traits are present in sexually reproducing organisms. These 2 may be identical or may be different depending on the percentage. A partner of inherited can be worked out with this assumption. So let's get into the activity. In the figure 8.3, so in what experiment we do to confirm that F2 generation did in fact have 1:2:1 ratio of tall with 2 T capital T and 1 capital T and 1 small t and 2 small t which is short trait combination. So when 2 capital T, that is tall plant, and with 1 tall t and 1 small t is also a tall plant, we could see that a single copy of capital T is enough to make the plant tall, while both copies have to be small t for parent to be short. So, traits like capital T are called dominant traits, while those that behave like small t are called recessive trait. The T's are just example of the trait inherited from the parents to the generation of plants. Let's get to work out which trait could be considered dominant and which one is recessive in the following figure 8.4. Now let us see what happens when pea plants showing 2 different characteristics rather than just one are breed with each other. What do the progeny of tall plant with round seed and short plant with wrinkle seed look like? They are tall and have round seeds. Tallness and round seed are thus dominant. But what happens when these F1 progeny are used to generate F2 progeny by self-pollination? A Mendelian experiment will find that some F2 progeny or tall plants with round seed and some were short plants with wrinkled seeds. However, there would also be some F2 progeny that show new combination. Some of them would be tall but have wrinkled seeds, while other would be short but have round seeds. You can see as to how new combination of traits are formed in F2 offspring when factors controlling for seed shape and seed color recombine to form zygote leading to form F2 offspring in figure 8.5. Thus tall or short trait and round seed or wrinkled seed trait are independently inherited. So here the round and green seed, the wrinkled and yellow seed is produce the F1 generation of round and yellow seed. When two round and yellow seed are crossed, which produce a round and yellow, a round and green, a round and wrinkled, and a round and wrinkled and green seed. When these four again tend to cross with those four seeds, we could get 16 other combination, and the final product would be 9 round and yellow seed, 3 round and green seed, 3 wrinkled and yellow seed, and finally only 1 wrinkled and green seed on total of 16 combination. So how do these traits get expressed? How does the mechanism of heredity work? The answer is cellular DNA, which is the information source for making protein in the cell. A section of DNA that provide information for one protein is called gene for that protein. How do protein control the characteristics that can be discussing here? Let's now take the example of tallness as a characteristic. We know that the plants have hormones that can trigger growth. Plant height can thus depend on amount of particular plant hormone. The amount of plant hormone made with dependent on the efficiency of process of making it. Now consider an enzyme that is important for this process. If this enzyme works efficiently, a lot of hormones will be made and the plant will be tall. If the gene for that enzyme has been alternation that make the enzyme less efficient, the amount of hormone will be less and the plant will be resulting in short. Thus, genes control characteristics or traits. If the interpretation of Mendelian experiment we have been discussing are correct, then both parents must be contributing equally to the DNA of progeny during the sexual reproduction. We have already discussed this in the previous chapter. If both parents can help determine the trait of progeny, both must be contributing a copy of same gene. This means that each pea plant must have two sets of genes, one inherited from each parent. For this mechanism to work, each germ cell must have only one gene set. So, the trait that is visible is dominant and the other trait which also been inherited but it is not dominant, it is recessive and has been hidden, and it could be in future generation become a dominant character and that could be revealed in further generations. So how do germ cells make a single set of gene from the normal two copies that our other cells in body have? If progeny plants inherited a single whole gene set from each parent, then the experiment explained in this figure 8.5 cannot work. This is because the two characters, the capital R, the round one, and the small y, the yellow wrinkled one, would then be linked to each other and cannot be independently inherited. This is explained by the fact that each gene set is present not as single long thread of DNA but as separate independent pieces, each called chromosome. Thus, each cell will have two copies of each chromosome, one each from male and female parents. Every germ cell will take one chromosome from each parent, and these may be either maternal or paternal origin. When these two germ cells combine, they will restore the normal number of chromosomes in the progeny, ensuring the stability of the DNA of the species is good. Such a mechanism of inheritance explains the result of Mendel experiments and is used by all sexual reproducing organisms. But asexual reproducing organisms also follow similar rules of inheritance. So now let us see how the sex is determined. We have discussed the idea that two sexes participating in sexual reproduction must be somewhat different from each other for a number of reasons. How is the sex of newborn individual determined then? Different species use very different strategies for this. Let's see the environmental cues. Thus, in case some animals, like few reptiles, the temperature at which fertilized eggs are kept determine whether the animals developing in the eggs will be male or female. In other animals, such as snails, individual can change sex, indicating that sex is not genetically determined. But however, in human beings, the sex of the individual is largely genetically determined. In other words, the gene inherited from our parents decide whether we will be a boy or girl. But so far, we have assumed that similar gene sets are inherited from both parents. If that is the case, how can genetic inheritance determine sex? So let's get into the explanation. The fact that all human chromosomes are not paired. Most human chromosomes have maternal and paternal copy. And we have 22 such pairs. But one pair called the sex chromosome is odd in not allowing being a perfect pair. Women have a perfect pair of sex chromosome but both called X. But men have mismatched pair in which one is normal sized X and the other is short one called Y. So women are XX while men are XY. Now can we work out what the inheritance pattern of X and Y will be? Let's see the figure 8.6. Half the children will be boys and half will be girls. All children will inherit an X chromosome from their mother, regardless of whether they are boy or girl. Thus, the sex of the child will be determined by what they have been inherited from their father. So, the father chromosome will determine the sex. A child who inherits X chromosome from her father will be girl, and one who inherits Y chromosome from him will be a boy. So now we brush upon what we have learned. Variations arising during the process of reproduction can be inherited. These variations may lead to increased survival of individuals. Sexually reproducing individuals have two copies of gene for same trait. If the copies are not identical, the trait that gets expressed is called dominant trait and the other is called recessive trait. Trait in one individual may be inherited separately, giving rise to new combinations of traits in the offspring of sexual reproduction. Sex is determined by different factors in various species, but in human beings, the sex of the child depends on whether the paternal chromosome is X for girl or Y for boys. So, for further questions and inquiries, doubts, you can anytime reach out to one on one tutoring at GoAskNow online classes. So, let's see what the next chapter holds. Thank you for listening.